Chapter 4. Throughout the night, I was either preparing for school, talking about it, asking my siblings about various aspects of it, or dreaming about it, because tomorrow would be my first day. Before going to bed, I had gone to our small wardrobe and started trying on my clothes and my new shoes. When my mother saw me, she shouted, "What are you doing, Ahmad?" I replied softly, "I'm getting ready for school." She laughed and said, "There's still plenty of time before school in the morning." In the early morning, I woke up to my grandfather's prayers and couldn't sleep afterwards. As soon as Mother woke up, I jumped out of bed to get ready for school. After a while, she woke up my siblings and sent my brother Mahmoud to wake up my cousins in the other room, where they slept with my grandfather. My cousins got dressed, and my mother dressed me up as if we were going to my own wedding. She gave me a lot of advice, praising me for being smart, grown up, and brave. Then she gave each of us a shilling, which was 5 agorot of the Israeli pound, and placed a piece of bread in our completely empty school bags. My mother repeatedly instructed Mahmoud to take good care of me. Mohammed was in the 3rd grade and at the same school as me, the Male Refugees Elementary School A. My sister, Maha, was in the 5th grade at the Female Refugees Elementary School B. And my brother Hassan was in the 1st grade of intermediate at the Male Refugees Intermediate School A. My sister Fatima was in the 3rd grade of our intermediate at the Female Refugees Intermediate School A. My brother Mahmoud was in the 2nd year of high school at Carmel School. My cousin Ibrahim was in the 2nd grade of primary at my school, and my other cousin Hassan was in the 1st year of high school at Carmel School. We all left the house together, with Mohammed holding one of my hands and my cousin Ibrahim the other, while my cloth school bag hung around my neck. We started our journey to the schools and eventually split up into different groups, with the 3 of us staying together. The streets were bustling with boys and girls of all ages on their way to school. The boys wore a variety of colored and shaped clothes, while the girls wore a uniform called al-muriallo, a blue and white striped fabric, with each stripe being half a centimeter thick. They tied their hair with white ribbons, and what distinguished us boys were our closely shaven heads. Upon entering school, we found a very large courtyard with tall trees and many rooms around it. Near the entrance, there was a small garden with flowers and plants and a pond. My brother Mohammed started to acquaint me with the school. "This is grade A, this is B, and this is C. These are the 2nd grade rooms, these are the 3rd. This is the teacher's room, the principal's office, the canteen, the bathroom, and the drinking fountains." The morning bell rang, and teachers started to organize the student lines. The older students quickly formed their lines, but we, the new 1st graders, were gathered by the teachers who started calling out our names. As each child was called, the child would stand to one side until we were divided into 3 groups, each led by a teacher. Our teacher was an elderly sheikh wearing a robe and a fez, indicating he was an Azhar-educated scholar. We entered the 1st grade classroom A, where we began to arrange us by height, shortest first into 3 groups, with 3 people each. 3 students sat on a wooden bench over a meter long and about 25 centimeters wide, with a board in front of us of the same length and about 40 centimeters wide for our books and notebooks. Underneath was another plank where we placed our bags, all held together with wooden supports to form a single unit called a bank. Turn that down a little. Called a bank. There were 3 rows of these benches in the classroom, each row with about 7 benches, and each bench sat 3 students. There was a space of about 1.5 meters between each row. In the center of the room, in the front of the benches, was the teacher's table and chair. On the wall was a blackboard, which we called allo. Each of us sat in the middle of the bench assigned by our teacher, Sheikh Hassan, who introduced himself and got to know each of us one by one. We each said our names, and Sheikh Hassan would ask us about our fathers, uncles, and grandfathers. He seemed to know everyone's family, which was evident when he made a special prayer for my father's safe return, knowing that my father was missing and his whereabouts unknown. Soon they brought us books, notebooks, pens, and erasers. Sheikh Hassan distributed these items to us. We each received a reading book with beautiful colored pictures and incomprehensible text, a math book, a part of the Quran, 5 notebooks, pencils, and an eraser. The notebooks, covered in green and red with the United Nations Education Department UNESCO logo, were something new to us. Sheikh Hassan explained everything to us. This is the reading book. This is the math book. Keep 3 of the notebooks at home. We will use 1 for reading and 1 for math. He then beautifully wrote each of our names on our items with a black ink pen. The school day ended, and Mohammed and my cousin Ibrahim took me back home. We each carried our cloth bags filled with stationery. As days passed, I began learning to read, write, and do arithmetic. I started memorizing short poems and short parts of the Quran like other students. We went to school together, played during the breaks, eating sandwiches made by our mother with thyme and ground pepper, and occasionally jam. Sometimes we bought labneh from the woman sitting at the school gate, savoring its delicious tangy taste. Back home, we would have lunch, then Mohammed and Hassan would head to Uncle Saleh's factory. Our time was divided, playing in the neighborhood and studying. In the evenings, we gathered around upturned washing basins with a lamp in the middle. Each of us would go to place our book on a notebook on it, bending over as we sat on the ground to complete our homework. My mother and the others, who didn't study, sat beside us, chatting. As the weeks passed, the sound of loudspeakers announcing curfews became a regular occurrence, signaling that one of the freedom fighters had carried out an operation against the occupation forces, usually involving a grenade attack or a shooting on a patrol. A significant event that year was the martyrdom of our neighbor Abu Yusuf. He, along with 2 other young men, had set out to execute a mission against the occupation patrols. Their strategy involved one of the fighters throwing a grenade at the patrol that regularly passed through the main street at a specific time, then retreating in a way that made him visible to the soldiers. Abu Yusuf and another fighter, armed with Carl Gustav rifles and grenades, lay in wait for the reinforcements that would pursue the first attacker. Unfortunately, they were ambushed from behind, and both Abu Yusuf and his comrade Ibrahim were martyred on the spot. This time the occupation forces did not impose a curfew on the camp. The entire camp, men and women, young and old, emerged from their homes, many grieving for Abu Yusuf. A majestic funeral procession was held, attended by all the camp's residents who chanted in solidarity with the martyr in Palestine. The crowd circled the camp several times, and coffins bore the martyrs and were buried in the nearby cemetery. That afternoon, my grandfather took me to a corner of our neighborhood where some men and elders gathered to talk and entertain themselves. While discussing current events, the topic of the day was the martyrdom of Abu Yusuf and his companions. Everyone was astonished, and there were discussions about possibility of betrayal as the attack came from an unexpected direction. Days later, as the sun was setting and the usual curfew was about to begin, we were playing in the neighborhood when several masked and armed freedom fighters filled the area, each taking up positions at the ends of the alleys. Abu Hatem, one of the camp's notable men, arrived dragging a man in a despicable and shameful state. Abu Hatem, armed with a bamboo stick and a rifle hung over his shoulder, stood over the man, who tried to hide his face and cower as much as possible. We all stopped playing, and the neighborhood residents gathered around, watching the scene unfold. In an eerie silence, broken only by the commanding voice of Abu Hatem, the events unfolded in a dramatic and chilling manner. People, you all know Abu Yosef, the leader of the popular liberation forces in the camp. You've heard of his antics and operations that made us all proud and disciplined the occupiers. And you all know this despicable man. He gestured towards a figure. A spy for the Jews, the one who monitored Abu Yosef and informed the Israeli army about him. The crowd murmured incoherently, their words unclear and inaudible. Abu Hatem, raising his stick high, demanded the traitor confess before everyone, under the threat of further beatings. The man, crouching and shielding his head with his hands, admitted to betraying Abu Yosef and his companions for a small sum of money, claiming he didn't know they would be killed. The crowd's anger erupted, cursing the traitor, as Abu Hatem silenced them with a gesture. Listen, people. The Jews have occupied our land, driven us from our homes, killed our men, and violently violated our dignity. And yet, there are those among us ready to betray the very freedom fighters who risked their lives for us. What should be the punishment for a traitor who collaborates with the Jews? The unanimous cry was for death. Abu Hatem took his rifle off his shoulder and aimed it at the spy's head. And as my mother covered my eyes, I struggled to see. But I heard the gunshots and the crowd's vengeful cries. Death to the traitors, death to the agents. The next day, fueled by the martyrs' blood, the freedom fighters ambushed an occupation patrol. As the jeep arrived, they hurled grenades and showered it with bullets, killing and injuring several soldiers before they could even retaliate. The occupation forces sent out massive reinforcements, surrounding the area and brutally dragging people out of their homes. The men were lined up against a wall, guns pointed at their heads, as the beatings and humiliations continued relentlessly. The intelligence officer responsible for the area arrived and began a meticulous inspection of the men, calling them one by one to his car. With his car door open, he interrogated each man under threat of rifles pointed at them, bombarded them with questions in hopes of unearthing any information about the freedom fighters. Days later, when the curfew was finally lifted, we resumed our school routine. During a break, I ventured to the washrooms where I found boys climbing a wall to peek at the nearby preparatory school where my brother Hassan studied. Joining them, I saw older students, much taller and seemingly more mature than myself. That day on our way home, amidst hundreds of students, I spotted my cousin Hassan at a distance. Between us, a throng of pupils, to my shock. I saw him raise a hand to his mouth, appearing to smoke a cigarette. I tightened my grip on the hands of my brother, Mahmoud, and my cousin Ibrahim, who looked at me puzzled, pointing towards Hassan. They failed to understand my concern. By the time they'd noticed, Hassan disposed of the cigarette and had reached our destination, opting for silence. I feared his retaliation. Back home, seizing a moment alone with my mother, I whispered, "I saw cousin Hassan smoking." She looked at me sharply, dismissing my claim as a mistake or illusion, and instructed me not to mention it to anyone. That evening, I noticed her quietly confronting Hassan, but their conversation remained inaudible to me. Days later, Mahmoud informed me that Hassan had skipped school that day. I saw the confusion on her face, wondering how to address this new challenge. The situation with Hassan remained an unsolved puzzle in our household. I witnessed my mother speaking intensely with my grandfather, calling cousin Hassan over for a stern talk. Despite Hassan's attempts to defend himself, they threatened to tie him to a post in the yard and beat him if he skipped school again. Days later, my mother found cigarettes and some money in Hassan's pants. She presented them to my grandfather, who was astonished and wondered how Hassan got money. When Hassan was called to explain, he faltered under my mother's interrogation, unable to justify his actions. My grandfather, weakened by age and worry, couldn't do much. My mother took charge, interrogating Hassan, who initially tried to dodge the questions. When faced with the evidence, Hassan admitted to stealing the money from my grandfather's purse. Outraged, my mother and grandfather decided to tie him to the post as punishment. My grandfather, upon realizing Hassan had taken half of the family's expenses, weakly introduced to tie him up. My grandfather, upon realizing Hassan had taken half of the family's expenses, weakly instructed to tie him up. My mother looked at my grandfather, seeking confirmation. He nodded. Affirmatively, his eyes glanced at us, indicating it was essential for us, children, to see the consequences of such actions. The message was clear. Wrongdoing must be met with appropriate discipline to set an example for the younger generation. My mother tied Hassan to the post while lamenting her and Hassan's misfortune. "Oh, the tragedy of you, the son of a martyr. Do you understand what a martyr is, Hassan? Your father was a martyr, and you steal half of what's in your grandfather's purse, despite our family's living expenses. Hassan, shame on you," she cried out in despair. Then she shouted at us, commanding us to go inside the room. Without hesitation, we all obeyed. That night a curfew was imposed, not only by the occupying forces outside, but also by Mother within our house. She forbade us from leaving the room all night, except for emergencies, and forced us to go to bed early. The atmosphere was heavy, with a mix of disappointment and discipline, a stark reminder of the consequences of wrong choices. My Aunt Fathia and her husband paid us a visit. My mother received my aunt with kisses and longing, and Aunt Fathia began to kiss each of us in turn. When Mother prepared the guests' bedding, she called out to Grandfather Abu Ibrahim to welcome the visitors. Grandfather emerged from his room to greet Aunt Fathia's husband, who brought a straw basket filled with several paper bags, which he handed to my mother. Fatima prepared tea, and they all enjoyed it together. Oh, my mistake. So Aunt Fathia visited Fatima, the other aunt, prepared tea, and they all enjoyed it together. Then Aunt Fathia's husband excused himself to go to Uncle Saleh's house, leaving Aunt Fathia to stay with us for the night. He promised to return the next day to accompany her back. Despite Grandfather's insistence that he stay with us, he politely declined, citing some urgent matters he must attend to. After he left, Grandfather returned to his room, and my mother, Aunt Fathia, and we children gathered around her. My mother brought out the basket and started unpacking its contents. Inside one of the bags were several large red apples, the likes of which we had never seen or tasted before. Another bag contained unfamiliar fruit, which I later learned was peaches, and the third had pieces of dried milk. Looking at Aunt Fathia, my mother said, "You shouldn't have troubled yourself, Fathia." Tears welled up in Aunt Fathia's eyes as she responded, "I wish I could do more to help you, dear sister." She explained that her husband's financial situation was not good, for which she was thankful. My mother then washed the fruits and handed out half the apples, the peaches, to Mahmoud and instructed him to take them to Grandfather and our cousins in the other room. Mother, Aunt Fathia, and I chatted late into the night, with us children joyfully surrounding them. Aunt Fathia's husband, Abdul Fattah, went to Uncle Saleh's house, where they spent the night discussing the situation in the Hebron area. The city and surrounding towns and villages Abdul Fattah had completed his high school studies a few years earlier and was helping his father in farming the sheep breeding. He was considering going abroad for university studies in Jordan or Saudi Arabia. Uncle Saleh was curious about the resistance, the fighters, people's living conditions, and the morale during the 3 years since the Israeli occupation. Since the occupation of Hebron, large groups of tourists began flocking to the city, particularly to visit the Ibrahimi Mosque, believed by Jews to hold historical significance for them. This influx of tourists sparked an economic revival in Hebron. Many local merchants seized the opportunity, opening their stores to offer various goods to visitors, often at high prices. They even sold oak gallows, which foreigners considered sacred from the land of Abraham. The economic boom didn't stop with tourists. Jews also came to Hebron to shop for various items, contributing further to the city's economic vitality. Notably, the Israeli soldiers maintained a respectful distance from the locals, seemingly following a request from the city's mayor, Sheikh Jahabari. He had met with the Israeli soldiers, including Moshe Dayan, that motherfucker, after the occupation, urging them to ensure that the soldiers did not violate the people's honor or property. The leaders, recognizing the importance of this, advised their soldiers to minimize interaction with the locals, simply for capital. The residents of Hebron, still reeling from the shock of the Six-Day War defeat, were largely fearful of the occupation and the Jews. Jews could roam the city without encountering resistance or hostility, as people fearing repercussions would prevent any acts of aggression against them. Despite the prevalent fear and caution, occasional resistance activities occurred. These were sporadic and included sniping or throwing grenades at Israeli patrols on the city's outskirts or in surrounding villages, while Israeli forces frequently emerged from the shadows and entered many areas unexpected. Some resistance fighters living in the mountains and caves engaged in guerrilla warfare against the patrols, causing injuries and on rare occasions fatalities. These fighters would then retreat to the rugged terrain, which was unfamiliar and daunting to the Israeli forces. Among those resistance fighters, one named Abu Shahar became particularly notorious, haunting the occupying soldiers in the area. The Fatah movement was attempting to organize resistance activities in Hebron and its surrounding areas, but successes were limited. The Israeli forces were quick to arrest groups and either initiated resistance efforts or were in the early stages before they could move. The focus of locals on their daily lives and economic activities seemed to impede the resistance from becoming a significant and widespread phenomenon in the region. However, a series of political movements organized by Fatah supporters, particularly among students, began emerging in the city. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, also attempted to initiate activities. Given the limited success in armed resistance, the focus shifted more towards political activism, social inactivities, and community engagement. During the discussions between my uncle and Abdel Fattah, my uncle was keen to understand the differences between the situations in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In Gaza, the PLF, Popular Liberation Forces, consisting of officers and fighters from disbanded Palestine Liberation Army post-1967 war groups, were the primary resistance group. Despite Israeli forces achieving some success in assassinating leaders and infiltrating deeper into Gaza, resistance groups including Fatah and PFLP maintained reasonably high level of activity. Days after my aunt's visit, a rumor spread in the neighborhood about a young woman's body found in the Mishat area. The body was discovered, and rumors rumors circulated that she was an informant killed on suspicion. While no one dared to openly challenge this narrative or inquire into the details, whispers and murmurs suggested she might not have been the informant after all. Some speculated that individuals posing as resistance fighters took advantage of her, violated her, and then killed her to avoid exposure, falsely labeling her as an informant. This incident heightened the intensified efforts by Israeli intelligence to infiltrate the Palestinian community, exploiting vulnerabilities like poverty and the need to recruit informants who could provide information on resistance fighters and their activities. The occupation forces carried out large-scale arrests of men and young adults, transferring them to Saudia building, the intelligence headquarters. There, they were greeted by a large number of soldiers who beat, slapped, and kicked them. Their eyes were blindfolded, and they were made to stand with their faces against the wall, hands tied behind their backs, for long hours, in the rain and severe cold, shivering from cold or anticipation, or fear. Soldiers stood behind them, taking turns on patrols, kicking and hitting anyone who leaned against the wall or moved, or left. In a nearby room, a member of Shin Bet officers, as it was called at the time, sat in a well-lit, air-conditioned room. They summoned the men one by one, seating them on chairs in front of them, and lifted the blindfolds, bombarding them with thousands of questions about their work, hometown, family, brothers, each of their neighbors, and about resistance fighters. They hurled hundreds of insults and curses, some of the foulest and most vulgar language imaginable, breaking the Arabic language they spoke. Sometimes they would hit, and others they would joke, alternating between the intimidation and enticement in search of information the men might have, or any readiness among them to cooperate, or any weakness that they might exploit to force them to corroborate against their own people. Some of the men were seething with anger and helpless in the face of this humiliation. But what could they do? Any action would lead to more humiliation and oppression. Some burst out in rage, wanted to attack the scum, only to find their hands tied behind their back and facing even more degradation. Others tried to get through the crisis as best they could, wishing to live peacefully, neither with nor against them, nor with or against the resistance, just wanting to live. Come here. Just wanting to live and provide for their families. A few sold their souls cheaply to the occupiers, beginning to provide all the information they knew about the resistance and its men, agreeing to deal with them. The situation of resistance in the Gaza Strip was noticeably stronger than in the West Bank, primarily due to the presence of a battalion of fighters called the Palestinian Liberation Army, established as a military force by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. Arab regimes at the time had pushed for its creation to alleviate their responsibility towards Palestine. With the 1967 war, this army partly disbanded. Some were martyred, and others, the majority, left the sector for Egypt or were deported there. Some stayed in Gaza and formed the Popular Liberation Forces, initiating the resistance. Then some groups and cells from Fatah and the Popular Liberation Front began organizing in the sector, increasingly present, especially in the refugee camp areas. One day, while we were in the morning lineup at school, a great commotion arose, followed by loud chants of, "With our souls, with our blood, we will redeem you." Palestine. With our souls, with our blood, we will redeem you. Palestine. Schools emptied, and students from different schools joined together in a crowd, echoing this chant and cry. Everyone was in great joy and overwhelming happiness. As that day coincided with the Day of Dignity, when Palestinian Fedayeen and Jordan successfully repelled an Israeli attack on the Jordanian front. The demonstrations and the demonstrators roamed the streets of the camp, chanting slogans and waving flags, before eventually dispersing as we returned to our homes. Everyone felt the utmost pride and dignity after the setback of 1967, with people commonly referred to, according to the local Arab regime's terminology, this was the first victory over the Israeli occupation army. From among the Fedayeen groups camping on the eastern block of the Jordan River in the Kamara area, some had started carrying out cross-border Fedayeen operations. Wow, it's a long chapter. Right. Fedayeen operations, 1 second. There we go. That afternoon, as usual, I sat with my grandfather in the square next to the corner of our house, where the men of the neighborhood gathered to talk. They were all extremely elated, and words like the Palestinian Revolution and the name of the National Liberation Movement, Fatah, started to resonate. It was clear that Fatah was beginning to take a leading position in the Palestinian national movement and resistance to the occupation that day. I heard the men say, "Uncle, true words don't plow the land, only its bulls do. We used to rely on Arab armies and were defeated. But the first time we fought for ourselves, we win, despite our limited means and weak arms." And all men nodded in agreement, supporting this sentiment. In the following days, the pace of Fedayeen operations inside the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza increased. Inside the occupied territories of West Bank and Gaza, my mother and her friends always used to say, "The spirit of men revives men." It seemed as if the victory of the Battle of Kardama had rekindled many souls with hope and readiness. Okay, 2 more pages. Hold the line, chat. It appears that the intelligence of occupation had gathered information indicating that many of the operations happening in Gaza originated from Al-Shanti camp. Consequently, a curfew was imposed on our camp. This time the curfew lasted much longer, exceeding 3 weeks and even a month, and our conditions in the camp worsened significantly. The camp had been under curfew for over a month. Life continued as usual, just tens of meters away in the city. The moon called a prayer rose from the minarets of the mosques in Gaza, Al-Abbas Mosque, located on the main street of the city, Omar al-Muqtadir Street, saw a number of men and young adults gathering for the prayer. After completing their prayers, a confident young man in his early 20s stood before them, and he praised Allah, blessing his prophet, and then began addressing the people, stirring in them strength and chivalry towards their brothers in Al-Shanti camp, where a curfew had been imposed for a month. An elder asked, "What can you do, my son?" The young man replied that they could at least hold a solidarity demonstration. The congregants in the mosque exited, chanting and praising, with some carrying their young men on the shoulders chanting, "With our souls, with our blood, we will redeem you, Palestine. We are Palestine. We are all Palestine. We are all migrants and citizens." People began joining the large demonstrations, and the city streets near the camp were closed. Occupation soldiers' vehicles monitored the situation from a distance, prepared for emergencies, but without intervening, the demonstration dispersed. And everyone felt they had done something and they'd done something that their conscience demanded. The next morning, loudspeakers announced the end of the curfew in the camp, allowing life to return to normal. In the morning, we lined up in school after some light physical exercises and a morning speech delivered by one of the students from atop the stone stairs in front of the lineup. We proceeded, one class after another, to the milk kiosk, a closed area on 3 sides with stone walls, roofed with zinc sheets. On its cement platform stood several large tables, behind which 4 men in blue overalls and white caps stood. We entered the kiosk line, supervised by our teachers. The men handed us one by one iron cups filled with milk, after giving us each a fish oil pill, instructing us to swallow it and drink the hot milk. We drank the milk, and we threw the cups into a large pot of boiling water, then left our queue for our classrooms. All students in all UNRWA schools drank milk and fish oil on different days. We detested fish oil with a blind hatred. Teachers watched us to ensure we didn't discard those small pills, forcing us to take them, urging us to drink the milk quickly and go to our classes. Fish oil is very beneficial, but the hot milk is just okay, with the best part being the warmth of the cup. When you hold it in your tiny hands, which are almost frozen by the severe cold, you typically feel as though your hands have become part of your body. Once again, after it felt detached for so long. On one of those days, the weather was extremely cold and stormy, and most of us got wet from the rain on our way to school. After we had the milk, we entered the classroom and we sat at our desks shivering. Our teacher, Sheikh Ali, entered and seemed to realize we are not in a state to study, read, or understand. He wanted to make us laugh. So he said, "Children, imagine if the sky was raining rice and meat right now." There was a commotion in the class, and we forgot the cold and wetness as we heard about the rice and meat. He started talking chaotically. "I will only eat the meat. I love rice. I love rice. I. Sheikh Ali let us indulge in our playful fantasies of rice and meat for a few minutes. Then he shouted at us, "Quiet, you and him. May God make it rain locusts to bite you all at once." He then instructed us, "Take out your reading book and open to lesson 20. Read, Ahmed." I opened the water-soaked book and began reading. Shivers from the cold, and Sheikh Ali's lips muttered, "There is no power or strength except through Allah. Indeed, to Allah we all belong to Him, and we shall return. You must learn so you can become humans, and that means civilized or educated people." That was chapter 4 and 5. We will do 6 and 7 tomorrow. Just glancing at the page,